So we are ICUJP. Welcome to our Friday forum for October 25, 2024. We're grateful that you're with us, either in person or watching a recording of this program. We have a really extraordinary speaker today, and we'll be turning to that shortly. Thank you, every one of you, for being here. Just a quick advance announcement. We are not meeting the day after Thanksgiving, so please make a note on your calendars. But we will continue to meet every other Friday, as we have done for 23 years. ICUJP has been at this. We've put on over 1,000 webinars like this, in person largely until COVID, and then we discovered Zoom, which does allow people as far as away as Pakistan to join us, and up and down the state of California and elsewhere. We do depend on the kindness of friends and strangers to support our work. There's a link in the invitation you used to get here today to make a donation. And we'd appreciate anything that is for you a significant contribution to let us keep doing this work. We have a small part-time paid staff. We do have regular expenses throughout the year. Freedom isn't free, and it does cost something to keep us going. In the chat, you'll see our link tree, which will take you directly to our website. We have an extraordinary roster of earlier Friday forums. We have ballot measure recommendations. As a 501c3, we are allowed to make endorsements of propositions, but not elected office. And the board met a few weeks ago, and we focused in on propositions where we felt our voice was relevant and we had something to say. So if you're filling out your mail-in ballot for statewide propositions and some local measures in LA, please take a look at our voter guide. So I am grateful to each one of you for your support. We will turn now to a reflection. We do this at the beginning of every meeting. And I was particularly eager to hear Rebecca's reflection, because she always brings something new and fresh to it. Rebecca.
Hi, thanks, Steve. Today, I want to reflect on the recent death of Gustavo Gutierrez, the father of liberation theology. I learned about his death on Democracy Now, and which I do watch every day now. I recently posted on Facebook is that now I don't even watch the weekend news shows that I used to watch regularly every Saturday and Sunday. I just wait for Monday to come and watch Democracy Now. But Democracy Now reported that Gustavo Gutierrez, when he died, he was a Peruvian priest known as the father of liberation theology. He died at 96. Liberation theology holds that ending poverty and helping those in need is an essential mission of the church. In his seminal 1971 book, A Theology of Liberation, he wrote about that poverty is an attack on human dignity and therefore contrary to the will of God. And this school of thought was popularized in Latin America during the 60s and 70s, and he received enormous pushback from the Vatican. And because it was anchored in Marxist principles, and it spread and played a big role in political movements, including the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. So I thought it was interesting that the Vatican push back on this. I was raised Catholic when I was born in East LA, raised in straight out of Compton, and my mother wanted me, even though she wasn't Catholic, she wanted me to be raised Catholic, but I left the church right when I entered college, I think, probably in my early 20s. I just couldn't, just bring myself in alliance, with the church. And I didn't go back for these decades up until this past Ash Wednesday. And what encouraged me to go back on Ash Wednesday was a liberation theology teaching. So I thought it was interesting that this liberation theology teaching that was pushed away by the Vatican actually encouraged me to go back and actually participate, with my local Catholic Church through the Easter season. I was introduced to it the end of last year after October 7th from I got an email to participate in a lament with this church out of East Jerusalem through Sabile. And through Sabile, I actually got to know some of you, including Daryl and Dawn. And they did this lament service that it reminded me so much of the Catholic Church. And it was led by Reverend Naeem Atik, and he's a prominent liberation theology leader. And it just brought home to me about the suffering and how we need to live our daily lives and align our principles to our community. And they addressed directly the genocide. And I was able to I've been attending every week since, and it's really given me a lot of hope. And I think that's what we need right now in these times. That's what I look for in religion. Like, I hear a lot of people say, well, I'm not religious, but I think this is immoral, what's going on in Gaza right now. And I am religious because I need that hope. And I believe in God, and I believe this is not God's will. And so anyway, I'm thankful to Gustavo Gutierrez. May his memory be a blessing, and I will continue on now in my spiritual journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. One of the beauties, and then I'll turn to you, Daryl. One of the beauties of ICUJP for 23 years has been the fact that we created a safe space, and we bring people into this circle, and we've learned a lot about each other, and we keep learning more about each other along the way. And it's reflections like the one you just heard that exemplify that. We have a board member, Fidel Sanchez, who was an early inspiration, urging us to know each other and to get to know each other. And many of us have done that outside of these meetings and elsewhere. And I'm very grateful when a reflection is grounded in a personal experience that's honest and authentic, like the one we just heard. A few more people have
add one thing. Can I just add one
sure.
thing? I forget what the trigger for me to go back to the church and actually get back involved with them again was when Reverend Atik told us on the week before Ash Wednesday, he said, when you go receive your ashes at your church next week, remember those Palestinians who are buried under the rubble and have turned to ash. And it just struck, the way he said it just struck me. And I said, I gotta go get it. I gotta go. I haven't done this in what, 40 years, but I gotta go. And it turned out to be a very fulfilling experience for me. And I met new community at this church.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Daryl.
A couple of things. Rebecca, you mentioned Paramount, and I served a Japanese church in Paramount for a few years. It was my favorite church. Most of them had gone through the camps here during World War II. But in
I'm a Paramount pirate.
Pardon me?
I'm a Paramount pirate. I went to Paramount High School.
Okay. In 1977, there was about a 10-day-long conference in New York at the seminary, Liberation Theology. This was 1977, and our keynote speaker was Gustavo Gutierrez. And we had Liberation Theology speakers from various backgrounds. Afterwards, I go to the office of the guy who was running it, Robert McAfee Brown, and I said, Dr. Brown, is anybody doing Palestinian liberation theology? Well, he didn't know. I don't even think he thought of that. And I had somebody in mind who was actually working at the UN, Fayez Sayegh, who was a Christian intellectual. And anyway, and then in 1984, I met Naim Atik in St. Louis at the General Assembly of our church there. And so he began the beginning of Palestinian liberation theology. In 2013, we celebrated the 25th anniversary of the founding of Palestinian liberation theology in Jericho, a very important place to meet. Anyway, I just thought that would be, you struck a chord with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daryl. I recommended our speaker today, and I was thrilled we were able to schedule Kevin at this time. I have known him now going whatever the period of time since the founding of the U.S. Committee to defend Julian Assange, upwards of 6 years or so. Kevin, walks the walk as a journalist. He is one of the only journalists I know who attended virtually all of the hearings in Julian Assange's extradition hearings many years ago. Growing out of that and his reporting and his journalism, Kevin wrote an extraordinary book, Guilty of Journalism. You can see a replica of the cover over his right shoulder on his screen. It is probably the best working book at that time, meaning there have been new events, of course, in Julian's case. But because of his authentic hands-on reporting, I got to favorably review that book and work with Kevin often. He was just a guest on Law and Disorder, a radio show that I'm co-hosting with Jim Lafferty, who's known to many of you, and Maria Hall, Michael Smith, and Heidi Bogazian. So we really are in the hands of someone who can speak to us about the current threat to freedom of the press in Gaza, the West Bank, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Killing journalists is the most effective form of censorship. And it is shameful what has gone on. I'm not going to steal any of Kevin's thunder. I'm thrilled he's with us, and the floor is yours, Kevin.
Thank you for that very gracious introduction, Stephen. Thanks for welcoming me. And it's been a pleasure to get to know Stephen in the work that I've done on Julian Assange and defending him. But of course, he's free now. So we transition to, I think, something that's a little bit more bleak, rather amorphous. I don't know, how do we stop what is unfolding with the Israeli government and the US backing it and allowing for, not just the destruction of media institutions in Gaza and the record number of killing of journalists, but that all happens within a context of genocidal violence, of a very clear and pernicious extermination campaign that we see waged more aggressively than ever over the last 3 weeks against the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. And that's something that I'll spend some time trying to help everyone here grapple with, because I am on a daily basis dealing with it as well. But I want to connect what we see happening with the threats against journalists in Gaza to our own country, to impress upon people that the threats to freedom of the press against these Gaza journalists, against these Palestinian journalists, against people within Israel, and that's connected to what we see happening here. That the degradation of freedom somewhere is a degradation to people everywhere. I'd say if truth is a first casualty of war, is a commonly known phrase, then any journalist that is still doing their job in Gaza, the West Bank, or Lebanon currently presents a threat to the Israeli military and its backers in the United States, because they are keeping truth alive. Overnight, 3 more journalists were killed in southern Lebanon by the Israeli military. They were sleeping in accommodations in an area that was not under an evacuation order. Cameraman Ghassan Najjar and engineer Mohammed Reda, who worked for Al Mayadeen, and then Wissam Qasim, a camera operator for Al Manar TV, were all effectively executed. A local news station broadcast this footage of collapsed buildings and cars that were marked press, covered in dust and rubble. That's according to an Al Jazeera English report. I'll frequently refer to Al Jazeera English coverage in what I do deliberately, because they are the media organization is the most explicitly under attack by the Israeli government, most explicitly being smeared and delegitimized because of the power of their work, the documentaries that they're putting out that expose the systematic war crimes and destruction of people. And it's effective. And the Israeli government would like to do anything they can to stop those journalists. So just prior to this attack, and what I was prepared to talk to you first this morning in my introduction, and then I had to add the deaths of more journalists, is that press freedom groups are extremely alarmed and outraged that the Israeli military posted photos and the names of 6 Al Jazeera journalists yesterday who are working in northern Gaza. They're some of the few remaining journalists who continue to do their jobs. And they fabricated dossiers against them, accusing them of being part of Hamas to justify future attacks against them. Obviously, they would like to kill them so that they no longer are putting out photos, videos. All of this is considered threatening to the project, the campaign that is being waged by Israel. So, just before we go forward here, again, let me just kind of pull back for those of you who are not familiar with my background. I'll give just a few more things just so as we get to the question and answer, you can bring out certain subjects and issues and know what I would be able to speak to. And this is also just because you're a fellow fire pup. Thanks, John, for being here and giving us all your presence. And John will know what I mean by fire pup. So, but I started doing this work back in 2010s when WikiLeaks and Julian Assange were putting out those documents about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think, like many of you, and during the global war on terrorism, I was very tuned in to what was happening with the occupation, the military occupation of Iraq. I wasn't as focused on Afghanistan, but let's just be clear, that's probably because of the propaganda that was out there in our news media that said this is a good war. Iraq is the bad war. Let's focus on what's going on there and let's ignore it. And then after Iraq, the Iraq occupation, the second Iraq occupation ended, or the second Iraq war ended, then I became more familiar with Afghanistan. I became very familiar with what was happening thanks to the disclosures from Chelsea Manning, and dug through these reports, these documents, did stories, gained some notoriety for some of the reporting that I did on the U.S. state embassy cables and various things. There's a crucial document that I was involved in reporting out. It was picked up by Glenn Greenwald. It was given additional coverage on Democracy Now!, and it involved a raid in Iraq that resulted in a massacre by, I believe, U.S. soldiers were involved. There was a UN special rapporteur who flagged it and was interested in investigating it. His name was Phil Alston. And it actually became a catalyst for preventing from President Barack Obama's administration from leaving a residual occupying force, or a larger residual occupying force, in Iraq. It forced the troops to actually have to leave because the Iraqi government said that they were not going to allow an immunity to be granted, an immunity clause to be given to soldiers so that they would be able to get away with any crimes committed in Iraq while they were deployed there. And Obama and other officials objected, so they just withdrew the forces rather than leave them in the country. So I covered these types of stories, and as I benefited from reporting on this material, it became clear that I needed to stand up for the whistleblowers. I needed to stand up for people who were coming forward and were under attack. And then, after doing reporting on Manning's military court-martial, coming to the defense, covering the way that they were incarcerated and treated in military prison, I got to know people who were exposing torture, challenging torture, people who were exposing surveillance, people who were whistleblowers that were challenging drone warfare, like John Kiriakou, Thomas Drake, Daniel Hale, Jeffrey Sterling, who was under attack by the Espionage Act. And all of these people who were courageously taking risks to speak out and challenge parts of the U.S. intelligence or national security state. And by 2019, I would admit that Julian Assange had mostly fallen off of my radar, but I was still tuned into these issues with whistleblowers and also paying attention to freedom of the press. And then this case blew up and he was expelled and arrested. And that has occupied my time, like it's been a focus of Stephen's for the last, say, 5 to 6 years. And only recently, because of what happened in the case collapsing at the Justice Department, do we now see he's free. We had an incredible moment where he was able to come forward and speak to a parliamentary assembly of the Council of Europe. And I thought it was moving that Julian Assange was able to connect the present to his own case and speak about how disturbing it is now that he's out of prison to sit and see a live streamed massacre on his computer just about every day. One of the most famous, or I suppose infamous videos that WikiLeaks was able to expose is called the collateral murder video. It is the targeting of two Reuters cameramen, and there's also later they called him a good Samaritan. There's a father with two children who end up rescuing or trying to help the wounded journalists, and then that van is fired upon. Those journalists are not saved. It was the collateral murder video. And there's basically one of those videos out there almost every 5 to 7 days. There's another something similar to that video. And I'll continue now by giving you some documentation of the death tolls. We're looking at around 140 to 170 journalists that have been killed in Gaza and Lebanon since Israel started this campaign. There are at least 125 or more journalists who have faced arbitrary detention. It's important for people to understand because this is somewhat frustrating for Palestinian journalists there, because the killing of their colleagues is far more significant. And yet it overshadows the systematic way in which the Israeli state is terrorizing journalists. And so you'll see people, you'll see from Palestinian journalist syndicate that they describe how there's still an emergency military law that Israel is applying to journalists. Other people are being detained under this law, but this goes back to the days of British colonialism, when British Army forces occupied Jerusalem from December 1917 to May 1948. They're using this law to justify what they call administrative detention, and they round people up, and they don't really even have to tell you why. They supposedly might have a secret security file, but they can just take you and hold you for a number of days, and then they could release you later. And there's absolutely no due process. And through their coercion and their intimidation of you, they can get you to actually agree to things like house arrest for an indefinite amount of time. And it can be very divisive. They might apply constraints to your movement and recruit your family to be involved in keeping you incarcerated in your home for an extended period of time. So this is a policy that is not given a lot of attention, because obviously the deaths or the assassinations of journalists is going to be more sensational. The administrative detention is something that's happening to dozens upon dozens of journalists and a couple of them are even forcibly disappeared, and we don't really know where they are, which might bring to mind the Central America or Latin American dirty wars period, when those journalists were terrorized in that manner. So going back to what I was saying here about the tally, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights published a report on the targeting of journalists that says that 166 journalists were killed in Israeli airstrikes and 4 were shot by Israeli snipers. There are 72 of these journalists who were killed along with their families in what are premeditated targeted attacks on their homes. So what they do is they wait until you as a journalist go home to your family, and then they kill you because they know they're going to be able to basically wipe off your entire family from the map. 52 journalists were killed during indiscriminate bombings. There are 24 killed in direct attacks, 22 killed while doing their jobs. And at the moment of this report from the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, there were somewhere close to 185 journalists that had been wounded. Wounded is a big issue as well. And you speak about democracy now, so I imagine you might be familiar with the 2 Al Jazeera journalists that are trying to obtain permission to be airlifted out so that they can get medical treatment. That's Ali al-Attar and Fadi al-Wahidi, who are in very critical condition. I believe al-Wahidi was paralyzed from the neck down and entered a coma and is going to die if he is not able to be evacuated to receive attention. The Israeli authorities are preventing or blocking passage to medical treatment. So I'll go through a couple stories. I gave you a lot of numbers. Let's put a few faces to some of this. So let's talk about some of the personalities. A very well-known example that press freedom groups have shared involves journalist Ismail Al-Ghul and cameraman Rami Al-Rifi from Al Jazeera. They were in the Al-Shati refugee camp, according to Reporters Without Borders. That's west of Gaza City, when an Israeli strike targeted their car, killing them both on July 31st. Images released by their colleague Anas Al-Sharif shortly after the strike at around 4 p.m. show the two reporters killed inside a white car isolated in the middle of an empty street, visibly damaged by a direct hit. Al-Sharif said the two reporters had been found decapitated. They were wearing their press vests. This is common. A lot of these people are signaling that they are journalists, and it's been accepted by a lot of these journalists that effectively has made them targets. The very next day, the Israeli army claimed to have targeted Ismail Al-Ghul, accusing him of being affiliated with Hamas. But an investigation by Reporters Without Borders showed the evidence was insufficient and inadequate. And in fact, I think some of the information they put out suggested that he would have been part of Hamas when he was 10 years old, which is absurd. So that's the kind of thing that they put out there. And then you're all watching Democracy Now!, so you're probably somewhat familiar with the attack on Wael Dahdouh, but I will bring this in because it's one of the more glaring examples, and he's had number of members of his family that have been killed or intentionally, it would appear, by the Israeli government. On December 15th, 2023, an Israeli drone launched a missile at Al Jazeera cameraman Samer Abu Daqqa and the correspondent Wael Dahdouh while they were with a civil defense team evacuating a trapped family from a targeted home near Farhana School in central Khan Yunis. They were injured, they were wearing their helmets, they had press attire, and Dahdouh managed to walk away. But his colleague Abu Daqqa and civil defense workers were at the site bleeding. Believe they tried to pressure or petition to evacuate Abu Daqqa, but they were not allowed to do so. The occupation forces intentionally delayed a Red Cross team from being able to get to him and save his life. Some of the testimony from Dahdouh is that I, along with my colleague, the photographer Samer Abu Daqqa, accompanied the civil defense after they received coordination to reach a trapped family in their home near Farhana School in Khan Yunis after an Israeli attack. We photographed the areas and documented the extensive destruction, reaching a point where no camera had yet reached. We tried to convey these scenes to the world through coordination and finished filming. While we were returning from the mission and walking several meters, something suddenly happened. I felt something significant had happened, and I fell on the ground with my helmet and microphone falling off. I tried to gather my strength and barely managed to stand, feeling dizzy and unsteady. I expected a second strike and estimated that staying in the area would prevent anyone from reaching me. So despite my unsteady state and severe bleeding from my arm, I decided to leave the area. I pressed my hand against one of the wounds and began walking until I reached the end of the street where a first aid team treated me on site. I informed them that we needed to return to our colleague Samer Abu Daqqa, whom I heard screaming and clearly injured. I estimated that his injury was in the lower part of his body. The field crew stopped the bleeding and told me to leave now and that another crew would come back to get Samer and the others out. But of course, they were not able to save Samer from death. I recently met a journalist here in the United States. His name is Nader Mahmoud, and he is the founder of a publication called Palestine in America. I did not know I would be promoting his work at this conversation with all of you, but I did just do an interview with him. I did an event with him with a colleague who's very well known in the Assange defense world, Chip Gibbons of Defending Rights and Dissent. We held an event at a cafe here in Chicago where I'm based that was vandalized. It's a Palestinian cafe called the Nabala Cafe. And Nader was there as a very welcome Palestinian voice who could be part of our conversation on freedom of the press. And they recently did a journalism edition, and they cover different people. And he interviewed a colleague in Palestine, in Gaza, and his name's Mohammed Mahawish. And what talking to Mohammed Mahawish illustrates, and what I had not fully grappled with, was the way in which all of these journalists are, as they report to us, also trying to survive, also trying to live their daily lives, also trying to find food, water, places in which they can take care of sanitation or hygiene, doing those things that we all take for granted. Those are not things as a human being that they can just stop doing when they are journalists. And so, as he would describe, we were dealing with displacement. This is from Mohammed, with evacuation orders from one place to another. And the place that we were ordered to evacuate a few hours later, Israeli soldiers across the same street that you were sheltering. And so there's no way back for you in there. So because the Israeli soldiers are over there, you can't go back to where you left. Even if you did, you're done, you're over. I've lost colleagues who have been in the same situation. I've lost a number of colleagues and friends and mentors and people who were by my side reporting since the beginning of the war. They didn't have the luck to survive these tactics and these strategies. So the Israeli military is constantly pushing people to different areas, and as they are being moved, they're closing off spaces that you can't return, and they're making the space. It seems like they're making it smaller and smaller, and that impacts journalists who are trying to do their work. The damage to equipment, that brings me to there's a lot to cover here, but I want to illustrate for you now the destruction of all the media institutions in the Gaza Strip, according to Palestinian Journalists Syndicate, since October 7, 2023. And this was at the end of September. So we've now had a month. You could presume that there's been more destruction, but what they calculate is that airstrikes have demolished 73 media facilities, 21 local radio stations. So that in those, that includes 21 local radio stations, 15 local and international news agencies, 15 TV stations, 6 local newspapers, 3 broadcasting towers, 8 printing presses, and 13 journalistic service institutions. So they've destroyed basically all media institutions in the Gaza Strip. And in the early days of this, Al-Shawa and Al-Hasiri towers in Gaza City, which had 15 floors of media offices, were completely destroyed by an Israeli airstrike on December 18th, 2023. And so Palestinian Journalists Syndicate say that by targeting all press facilities and equipment, the Israeli military not only cuts off any source of images and information in Gaza, but also compromises the logistics of journalists, what they need to be able to carry out their mission. There are around 4,000 journalists that are international journalists. They are based in Israel, attempting to cover this war, but they are barred from accessing Gaza. And what I learned through Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, who just recently put out a collection of dispatches on what has been unfolding over the last decade, that since 2006, Israeli journalists are actually barred from going to Gaza. And so we talk about foreign journalists, but we need to understand that if the Israeli government won't let journalists from within their own country access Gaza, then it's going to certainly be even more hard for us to get foreign journalists access. And the only way you can get in as a international journalist is to embed with an Israeli military unit. And we can think of this in much the same way that we thought about our own U.S. media embedding with the U.S. military during the Iraq occupation. and in the 2000s. There's a foreign media law that was passed in April of this year. It was endorsed, very widely supported by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and officials in the Knesset, which is the legislature, and that they wanted a ban that could be explicitly used to ban Al Jazeera from being able to operate within Israel. This law, it would seem, also has been utilized to go and shut down the offices in the West Bank, even though that is supposed to be a completely independent entity from Israel. They illegally went in and raided and shut down the West Bank offices of Al Jazeera. All of this unfolds with great responsibility by the United States. At any moment, they could make all of this stop. And that would make sense to those of you who are listening to this presentation, because if we talk about how they could just stop sending arms shipments and that would end the killing, that would stop the bombing of hospitals, the destruction of schools and churches, places of worship, etc., cultural landmarks, the total erasure of cultural history, that if the U.S. wanted to, they could stop that. Well, they could also stop the total destruction of every media institution in Gaza. They could stop the war, these attacks on journalists in Lebanon. They could stop any attacks that are being carried out. They could pressure the Israeli government to stop settlers from terrorizing people in the West Bank, which is what is happening under cover of the genocide in Gaza. And so, that brings me to just, reminding people, I think you're aware, but the figure for aid is now somewhere around $20 billion in the arms shipments that have been sent to the Israeli government. We now have 100 soldiers that have been deployed there with an anti-missile defense system, a sophisticated one, to help facilitate an attack on Iran, which we know there will be some kind of retaliation likely. And when Iran responds, that will officially bring those U.S. soldiers and the U.S. government into a war between Israel and Iran, in addition to the carnage in which I have described. And that would be actually an illegal action to be involved, because there is no declaration of war. There's been no consideration by the U.S. Congress of having the U.S. military be involved as a party with Israel in fighting Iran. So to endorse and support this is very, very bleak, in addition to the fact that we know that these wars are being used as cover to allow for the extermination campaign and the annexation of parts of Gaza to continue. It makes it harder for us to challenge. We're distracted. I think it's probably pretty overwhelming to listen to me today, because we could go off in many different directions. Are we going to talk about Lebanon and the attacks on people in Beirut? Are we going to talk about the West Bank? What's happening within Israel? What are we going to talk about? What's going on in southern Gaza, northern Gaza? And and then I remind, and then talk about Iran. Well, okay, so what's the issue of the day? It becomes rather confusing and dizzying because there is so much going on. And I think that's intentional. I think that Israel and the people just keep going after all different forces that they can, because every new attack becomes that news of the day, and it takes the atrocity that has outraged us the most off of the news pages and makes it impossible for us to respond and hold anybody to account or pursue justice. See, the death toll just keeps rising and rising. So I'll start wrapping up. I've been talking for quite a while, but I do want to, in these last few minutes, just tie this all back to the state of press freedom here in the US, and just very generically say that the case of Julian Assange is one in which we see that the Espionage Act could be applied to journalists if the US government would like to choose. So we're seeing an example over the last week and a half. There was We don't know if it was a leak for sure, but it's possible that there was a disclosure of leaked documents on the Israeli operations, their preparation to attack Iran. And if that's a whistleblower or a leaker, it's somebody who might be doing this because they wanted to stop an escalation, stop a wider war on Iran. We don't know, but we know that the government has all these tools at their disposal in order to find whoever released this, punish them severely, and silence them, and make them pay for revealing this truth to us, which I think was in the public interest. Although there are many of my colleagues in the news business who see it differently and are very proudly declaring how they are not going to publish the actual documents so all Americans can read them on their news websites. We should consider also that nonprofit organizations face a distinct threat to delegitimize their work, and there are a lot of news media organizations and journalists who depend on these nonprofits for funding. It's a faction of Republicans right now, but that doesn't mean there isn't support from a handful of Democrats to take the tax-exempt status away from these nonprofit organizations because they would dare to support Palestinian causes, justice. We've seen sanctions against Sami Doon just for the fact that they provide prisoner solidarity and cover attacks on what's going on with Palestinians who are imprisoned and in detention in Israel and beyond, and in the occupied territories. And we should consider also that something that has been a feature of the U.S. for well over a decade now, you go all the way back to the infrastructure instituted after the September 11th attacks, is a power of Homeland Security and the customs and enforcement agents to stop you at the border if you're a journalist, and do so with, it hasn't been decided that they actually need to have reasonable suspicion. You can have suspicionless searches where they take you to a room and they can take your devices and your laptops. And this is something that constitutional groups like the Knight First Amendment Institute, I know the ACLU, others have challenged and fought. And there's been some movement in the direction of protecting people's rights, but it's not very solid. It's one of those things where it's still a debate between the different circuits and district courts. And so that leaves all journalists, particularly Arab, I would say Arab, Middle Eastern, African journalists as well, I would add, vulnerable to being searched and having their sources compromised. And then, if I could just conclude, the close ally of the UK, which made Julian Assange a political prisoner, and which the UK being a close ally of the US, at any time the United States could make it clear that this is alarming and it should stop. However, what we are seeing in the United Kingdom over the last few months is that they are escalating the use of terrorism laws, provisions of terrorism laws, to go after journalists who are supportive of Palestinians. A few of these people are, at least one of them is known as a reporter on the Assange case, Richard Medhurst. But Asa Winstanley, who wrote a book about weaponizing anti-Semitism, the way that Jeremy Corbyn was taken out by Israeli lobbying groups. He had his home raided and might be facing charges. There's a journalist by the name of Sarah Wilkinson who had her home raided. And there's also a campaigner by the name of Tony Greenstein, who is both a writer and a longtime Palestinian solidarity activist who has faced targeting. And I just bring this in to say that this is the kind of thing that we see in India, or you would see in Pakistan, or you might see in Iran, or these different countries that the U.S. government steps out here with their officials and likes to lecture on how to protect freedom of the press, but they don't have any comments for the United Kingdom on how they are compromising freedom of the press. And obviously, they don't have any introspection about what the United States is doing to make it more unsafe for journalists, which we absolutely are, through the imprisonment of Julian Assange, who was a political prisoner, and through the destruction of media and the assassinations of all of these journalists in Gaza. What the United States has done has put press freedom at risk on a greater scale than, I'm much younger than a lot of you, so I'll just say in my lifetime, I've never seen it this dangerous. We're going to have a question and answer period and discussions. You can let me know if you think this is more of a dangerous era than at any time for the press. The one silver lining is that we can see this week to week. We're always getting images, we're getting videos. There's a lot of reports. It's almost impossible to suppress the reality of what Israel is doing. But with that being said, there's a lot going on here to deter and discourage and make people think twice about doing this reporting. I think it's riskier than ever. More likely that if you're doing this work, you are going to lose your life and possibly lose your entire family. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. What I'd like to do is have a brief time where I want to follow up with some questions and make this more of a conversation between you and me at this stage, and I hope others then will chime in with questions as well. I want to start with Julian Assange because this group has followed that case closely. Many of us are actively involved in that campaign, and it's not over. And that's a message I hope we can communicate today. So, Kevin, tell us a little about how, and in any more detail as you're able, Julian finally reunited with his family, has begun to physically and emotionally and mentally recuperate. Expand on his first public statements and the way you felt he so effectively connected his cause to the wider cause for freedom of the press. Then tell us about efforts to secure a pardon for Julian. And then finally, in this section, what the Council of Europe and other bodies have done to expressly find that he was a political prisoner and to call for an investigation of the English court system and its extradition proceedings and how they literally were able to extract his incarceration while that was pending, despite the fact that most observers, journalists and others, and now the Council of Europe, saw him as a political prisoner. So there are kind of three aspects to updating us on Julian.
Right. Okay, so there's a big concept that has become a popular, I suppose, way of trying to tackle the systematic injustices that we are seeing. And it was a phrase that was used multiple times by Julian Assange in his comments to this parliamentary assembly, and it's transnational repression. He spoke about this. And I mention this because in the last week or so, we saw that the Justice Department has announced charges against an Indian government employee in connection with a foiled plot to assassinate a U.S. citizen in New York City. And Pramila Jayapal said, "The rise of transnational repression is dangerous. Attorney General Garland is exactly right. Any person who seeks to carry out such repression will be held accountable, regardless of their position or proximity to power." But it was not lost on people who have supported Assange that this is somewhat similar to what we saw happening with the United States going after Julian Assange. We know that Mike Pompeo, as CIA director, and others contemplated plots to kill or kidnap Julian Assange, effectively rendition him, bring him to the United States extrajudicially. There were not charges that were on the table yet when they were thinking of trying to basically break him out of the Ecuador's London embassy and fly him to the United States. And so I just bring this in here as the context of this body of European Union member states composed of very close allies. Julian Assange knew their position, and he spoke to them by basically saying, like, if you support the resistance and the fighting of Ukraine against Russian military aggression, then you should also support helping me to be recognized as a political prisoner. You should also, be engaged in challenging the massacres in Gaza. And that was, he did it much more eloquently than I'm doing today, but he was good at presenting the moment in which we find ourselves to people and connecting his case to what's been unfolding for, while he was in detention at this Belmarsh high security prison for over 5 years. He's recuperating. He seemed to still have the ability to command a space and inspire people. That being said, he was extremely nervous when he stepped before this group of people. And when he read his prepared statement, I thought it took him a while to get over those little the butterflies in his stomach. It had been a while since he had done any public speaking like this. He had Stella, his wife, Stella Assange, who is one of his biggest advocates for his freedom, sitting next to him. He also had Christian Harafson, who is the WikiLeaks editor-in-chief, sitting on his other side. That made him more comfortable, I believe, to field. Also, the body was embracing him because there was a resolution that was on the table, which ended up passing to declare him a political prisoner and make some recommendations to the United States to say, yeah, we oppose the way that the Espionage Act is being applied to journalists. And I think they're also opposed to the way it's applied to whistleblowers. We believe that the Espionage Act at minimum should be reformed. This was in their resolution. And they made various recommendations about what the United States should stop doing in its transnational repression of journalists. And so, this case now going forward is one in which anybody, it just should be made clear, anybody who is in the U.S. Justice Department could reasonably use it as a precedent to go forward and charge journalists who are doing work on Gaza, doing work on any other parts of the world, regardless of the political affiliation of the president at the time, a Democrat or a Republican. It's been pretty clear that we could see cases going forward. And Julian Assange was there to sound the alarm and say, European countries particularly have a role to play in stopping the U.S. from making the world more unsafe for journalists.
And the movement for a pardon and the investigation, the call to investigate how the UK handled the case.
Yeah, so there are a couple things going on. So with the pardon, I'm not sure how serious it is yet by Assange's people, but certainly they have called for President Joe Biden to issue a pardon for Julian Assange. And then in the UK, what I should say about the UK is that Stefania Marizzi, my colleague, an Italian journalist who has done some fantastic work submitting Freedom of Information Act requests to different government agencies in the countries that are implicated in Julian Assange's light and what he went through. She has an unfolding appeal to pry loose the role of the United K in keeping Julian Assange in prison. And then now, my friend and colleague Chip Gibbons at Defending Rights and Dissent, they've started going after documents from the Justice Department on Julian Assange's case as a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. So we have a chance at transparency. I mean, we've reached the part where no longer are we trying to free somebody from prison. We're fortunate to be beyond that, but now we need to set the record straight. We need to get these documents out. We need to create a historical record. In my mind, I think it's going to be a decades-long struggle to get all of this information released so people can know what exactly was done to Assange and WikiLeaks during the last 10 to 15 years. I don't think it's hyperbole to maybe compare it to the struggle that people have had over JFK assassination records, because these are kinds of things that the US government really does not want people to see. These agencies, this implicates the CIA, the FBI, all of these different institutions, and especially these institutions believe they were wronged when they were exposed. They don't think that the documents exposed crimes and torture and human rights abuses, etc. They think that they were attacked, and because of that, whatever they did is justified, and they don't really feel like defending it in the open. So we have to fight to force transparency and see exactly how deep this goes. What exactly were they trying to do? Who else was targeted? We've heard rumblings of unindicted co-conspirators of Julian Assange. We know there were journalists that were approached by the FBI in the last year and a half to try and make them be witnesses at a potential trial for Julian Assange. So we need to know just how far the government was going to target this media organization.
I want to reinforce what you're saying. It was the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which is made up of 46 nations that are members of the Council of Europe, that earlier this month expressed deep concern at the disproportionately harsh treatment faced by Julian Assange, and said that it had a dangerous, chilling effect that undermines the protection of journalists. The resolution recognized that he was a political prisoner as defined ever since 2012 in the articles of the organization. They called on the US to urgently reform the 1917 Espionage Act. Let me pause there, Kevin. We know that on the face of it, the Espionage Act has no defense for the motives or the intent of the defendant, no public interest defense. Tell us, based on your research, why the Espionage Act sits on the books, is a loaded gun, and what efforts are being made to reform it now before it's used again against journalists.
Yeah, so first with Julian Assange, we see that apparently it is fair for the Justice Department to apply it extraterritorially. So you don't have to be a US, they've said clearly you don't have to be a citizen of the United States to be guilty of violating this law. So all international journalists that do reporting on the US military, and that would include people who are covering the war that Israel is waging against Palestinians in Gaza because of the US military support for Israel. There's all kinds of relationships that could be exposed. So if those journalists got their hands on documents and they were doing reporting, they could potentially be guilty of journalism under the Espionage Act and charged and, attacked in the manner in which we saw Julian Assange. I thought it was very powerful that Julian Assange said to this body that he is free because he pled guilty to journalism. He said, "I am not free today because the system worked. I am free today after years of incarceration because I pled guilty to journalism. I pled guilty to seeking information from a source. I pled guilty to obtaining information from a source, and I pled guilty to informing the public what that information was. I did not plead guilty to anything else." This is why Julian Assange can wake up every single day and be confident that he did not, betray his principles. He did not sell out. He only pled guilty to doing the thing that the United States says is a crime. And as he spoke and has said, he said during his hearing when he pled, he told everyone that the First Amendment is in direct conflict with the Espionage Act. And right now there's no push, no meaningful political push in the legislative branch or among any people with influence over the US government to reconcile the fact that the Espionage Act is on the books and is really a threat to the Constitution and the First Amendment. And so there are smaller efforts, and I think it's to be lauded, especially considering what she's going through and has gone through as a voice challenging the genocidal violence. Rashida Tlaib was one of the main people to step forward and give those who want to do something to radically alter the Espionage Act and curtail its abusive power. She helped the Defending Rights and Dissent organization come up with some legislation to be put on the table. There were some sponsors. It's never really gone through a process to where it could get voted on and be included in any kind of legislation. So the little effort has died. But what they've tried to do is say, well, if we're going to have an Espionage Act, let's have a public interest defense. But let's also say that you're not going to charge journalists. You're not going to actually put into the reformed legislation, or the amendment would be that it is not going to be applied and used against journalists. But I would say that if you are not the person who has access to that information because you signed a non-disclosure agreement and you agreed to keep classified documents secret, that there should be no way that the Espionage Act could be applied to you. That should be the most minimal reform that we would all accept. I'm actually of the view that we should abolish it because of all of that I know with the Espionage Act and the way it originated in the 1900s, particularly in the era of Woodrow Wilson. And it was explicitly designed to go after those who were opposed to war. It's been used against pacifists and socialists and communists and anarchists, and that it was just a way of suppressing dissent that Democrat did not want to have to deal with when he was in power. So, being that it was part of a whole slew of anti-sedition laws that were up for consideration and passed during that time period, I think that this relic of that era should be completely removed. But then we do have to contend with what would be in its place. And so when you think about that, I understand why there are groups that are reticent to say, let's just remove it. Let's try to amend it, and then we'll deal with it. But the problem that is underappreciated and I think hard for average citizens to get into, because it's really getting into the weeds, is that this Espionage Act passed before we had a classification system for documents. And so it's been used after the fact of creating a system of top secret, secret, confidential, and unclassified, but for official use only materials in order to go after people and punish them, when it was never really a tool to help the government safeguard secrets. It was more to say, like, okay, I'm going to go after somebody because I believe they're behaving in treasonous or seditious manner against the United States, and we want to punish them. I mean, it really was along the lines of what became popularized with Senator Joseph McCarthy, of like, they are not loyal Americans, and so we're going to use the Espionage Act to punish them.
We're going to go to questions in a moment. I wanted to indicate that Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat of Oregon, and Representative Ro Khanna of California, back in March of 2020, introduced legislation to reform the Espionage Act, and that bill gained very little traction. One can only hope that other efforts can be made to renew that kind of legislation and push for it. I'll defer a few other questions I have to call on others. Carol Francis.
Thank you. I really appreciate this, Kevin. I promise I will get the link to this video when it's on our website out to as many people that have been invited but didn't show up today. This has been really important, and it's something that everybody in the Palestine Solidarity Movement needs to listen to. Could you, I have long since wanted to have a movement to abolish the act which Eugene Victor Debs and others have been given 10-year sentences for speaking out against the war. Can you talk more about the history of the act? Has there been anybody who actually has committed treason that was really dangerous to the interests of the people of the United States been convicted on it? Because all we know are those people who were convicted for speaking out against government crimes.
So the answer to that question is, it depends. I mean, it depends on how seriously you take it if somebody is spying on behalf of a foreign power. I don't know though. I'll just be honest that as far as the crimes that can be committed in this world, the idea that you're taking information from the US government and passing it back to your handlers in Soviet Russia, to me, doesn't rise to being like the kind of crime that we need to stop the world and prosecute immediately, especially when, I see what's happening in Gaza, especially when I see what happens with Iraq. Just as I'm trying to, is it against the law? Does it suggest that you are, I mean, again, like there are people like Aldrich Ames. There are others that were prosecuted with the Espionage Act that are not whistleblowers, and they're definitely not leakers. They never released information. They weren't trying to expose injustices. They had their own agendas, and certainly the Espionage Act has been used to go after them. But the history of the Espionage Act that I know, that I spend most of my time focused on, and that I think delegitimizes it entirely, is the way in which it now just goes after anyone who has classified documents. Basically anybody who takes documents. You don't have to show that there's any harm. It's actually a part of the prosecution that they don't have to prove any harm from your actions. They can still punish you by the mere fact that you took those documents or that you have them. And then now they're even going so far as to challenge people for violating parts of the Espionage Act when they fly a drone around military installations. And if you are, if you're from China or Iran or Russia and you get caught flying a drone, I would say you need to be extraordinarily careful about where you flew that nearby. Are you nearby any DC or military bases or whatever? They might think that you're using that drone to send information back to your government because they think you're deployed as a spy against the United States. So the history that people really need to know is that Daniel Ellsberg is the model case back in 1971 of how you can go after, or back in the early 1970s, of how you can go after someone and silence them for exposing what the United States government is doing. That was the Pentagon Papers and the Vietnam War. There hadn't really been any journalists at that point, but we know that there were threats that were issued against Beacon Press for wanting to defy efforts to censor. They were going to put out the Pentagon Papers in print form, and there were threats by the Nixon administration at the time. And then these journalists like Seymour Hersh, James Bamford is known for doing work on the National Security Agency. And those people received threats to come after them. And so when you look at the whistleblowers that have been targeted, and then you consider the journalists that have faced attacks, and particularly under Obama, I remind everyone that President Obama, under his time in office, from would have been January 2009 when he was inaugurated all the way through to January 2017, there were more people prosecuted under the Espionage Act for leaks than all previous administrations combined. Those were all people who were challenging facets or aspects of the war on terrorism, like surveillance, or in the case of like John Kiriakou saying waterboarding was torture and challenging that, found himself being prosecuted under the Espionage Act. These were people who were speaking out. There were leaks. There were people, these were sources. These were not anybody who had it as their stated beliefs that they wanted to bring down the United States. They didn't go out there and say, I am aligned with this government and I want to stop the US from being a successful country. So that to me is why the Espionage Act probably should not exist.
Thank you both. There is information. There have been over 70 prosecutions under the Espionage Act. There have been a few. You may remember the name Aldrich Ames, who was a former CIA counterintelligence officer who was convicted of spying in 1994. Robert Hansen. So there have been a handful of actual spies, although one could dig deep into that label. But clearly the abuse of the act is the way that Kevin has described it. Let's turn to Shahzad.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, Kevin. I have a question with you. Did you know about Arshad Sharif? He was killed in Kenya. He is a journalist from Pakistan.
I must confess that I'm not familiar with that particular case.
Say his name slowly and tell us about that case.
He's a journalist from Pakistan. He had so many threats in Pakistan. So they moved to Kenya. And after 1 month, he was killed in Kenya. He is a journalist from Pakistan. Arshad Sharif.
Thank you for sharing that story.
As we begin to close, tell us about the Dissenter, which you publish. What's the scope of that work? How can people get access to it?
Thank you, Stephen. The Dissenter Newsletter is a newsletter that grew out of my work covering the war on whistleblowers. Some of the earliest cases I was focusing on with this newsletter were people prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Reality Winner was a well-known, actually has a couple films now on what she went through being prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Then Daniel Hale and also Terry Albury, an FBI agent and whistleblower who challenged the way that the FBI is going after immigrants and coercing them into becoming informants If they decide that they do not want to be informants, then they may face deportation, or their lives might become more difficult as immigrants in the United States. So I focused on this, and then my focus is developed further. And with Julian Assange's case, the scope of the newsletter is on whistleblowing, government secrecy, and press freedom. And to basically tie that all together and show the different examples of this. And we didn't get into things domestically that are unfolding, but I've spent some time, in addition to what's going on with journalists in Gaza, to also pay attention to what student journalists are facing. Student journalists are going out on their college or university campuses and attempting to cover peaceful encampments by Palestinian solidarity activists. And those institutions are cracking down on those encampments and inviting police to raid those assemblies. And then while that's happening, those journalists are being hit with arrests or being threatened if they are there and present to report on that police response. So those kinds of stories I bring into the newsletter as well, along with all of the destruction of media institutions that I spoke about earlier in my presentation. You can subscribe to the free newsletter, and that is something anybody can access at the dissenter.org. And then it's a subscription newsletter. I have ways for people to support it by giving a nominal, a small amount every month to get access to. I do some additional articles for people who are subscribers, but then also there's an annual subscription that is available, but anybody can access this. I want this information to be available to people so that I can play my small part in amplifying the stories of what these journalists and whistleblowers go through all the day, every single day. And to keep it broad, I'll conclude by saying that I take a very broad view of what it means to be a journalist, and I take a broad view of what it means to be a whistleblower. For another presentation, perhaps, to have me back, considering that a whistleblower could be somebody who works for a labor union and is challenging retaliation by their boss, or there's a push to say that land defenders are whistleblowers, people who are indigenous, who are on land that is being destroyed by oil or fossil fuel companies and face terrorism of its own kind, that they themselves, as they are singled out for their work, are whistleblowers in their land defense organizing. And so I embrace a very broad view of what it means to be a journalist and a whistleblower, and very broad ideas of what should remain secret in the hands of the U.S. government.
The Dissenter is a accessible website. All of us should subscribe to it, and if you can, support it financially. It runs stories under whistleblowing and secrecy. And you have a podcast, Kevin. Is that true as well? Tell us about that.
I do an interview show. Perhaps some point I should talk to you, Stephen, but I do an interview show, and I was very fortunate to get to talk to Gideon Levy a couple weeks ago. I've talked to Norman Solomon about his book, War Made Invisible, which is exceptional. I use this as a space to have conversations that are outside the scope of just whistleblowing and government secrecy and press freedom, but I usually find a way to connect it back to my focus.
Tell us, turning back to the core of your remarks today in terms of the suppression of free press in Gaza and inside Israel, are there any proceedings pending before any organizations around the world any legal efforts to respond to this kind of suppression? Have any UN agencies taken an interest? And we are an activist organization. And what do you think a bunch of activists could do in response to the alarming reporting that you've done on this and that you've told us about today?
In the posting to your website, I had flagged the effort led by Jim McGovern, who is a House Democrat, to pressure the U.S. to say something to the Israeli government about how wrong it is to bar these 4,000 international journalists from accessing Gaza. And there's 63 others, I believe, who support this request. I do think that it sort of misses the forest for the trees, to use a phrase, because the real issue is that we see these constant killings of Gaza journalists. We need to see those people as human beings, and we need those in our Congress to stand up for them. So, if I was going to make any ask, if you were going to put your phone and call into your daily phone call into your representative or whatever you do, or send an email, I would say that there needs to be some outrage about what's going on in targeting these journalists. There's a UN special rapporteur report that I could have read some more from, but from the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression. Their name is Irene Khan. There was a report put to the United Nations General Assembly about what is happening as a result of the war on Gaza. And it didn't just only deal with the state of the media in Gaza and those attacks, but also what we're seeing happen to freedom of speech and expression in Western countries, Germany, France, Spain, and the United States. We're seeing a kind of wave of McCarthyism for people who are afraid to identify themselves as supporters of Palestinians for fear of losing jobs, etc. So that was raised there, and also raised that how awful it is that the Los Angeles Times made it into this report because there was a movement among their journalists to condemn the killings of Gaza journalists very early on in this war. And then those who signed on to it were informed they were now restricted from covering anything related to Israel or Palestine. And they'd have to wait for like 6 to 8 months before they could go back to writing or reporting anything related. And that was an alarming thing that was mentioned. You were holding the report right now, Stephen.
I am. I am going, first of all, I interviewed Irene Khan yesterday, the UN Special Rapporteur. And the interview will be broadcast Monday on Law and Disorder Radio, and I will distribute a link to that interview. She was hard-hitting, candid. The report itself is less than 30 pages, but packed just with the kind of information that Kevin has shared with us today. There's an entire section on campus protest and dissent, in which he is very explicit in condemning colleges and university administrations for suppressing that kind of dissent. There are detailed footnotes. It is an amazing report coming from a high-level UN rapporteur, and it deserves a lot of attention. I do want to conclude with you, Kevin, by thanking you. You do this work every day. We have a habit here of granting you card-carrying membership in ICUJP. You are an official member in good standing. I know you're a busy guy. Please join us on any Friday mornings that you're able to. And we are going to continue to track your work. You and I will do that immediately. And it's just a credit that independent journalists like you exist, that you do this work every day. I urge folks to get a copy of Guilty of Journalism if you want a thorough examination of the Espionage Act and Julian Assange, and support the Dissenter Newsletter. It's in the chat, and for people that don't have access to the chat on the recording, it's info@thedissenter, one word, .org. Anything to conclude your remarks, Kevin?
In general, let me thank everyone for being here and your engagement. I appreciate it. I realized that I neglected to mention one particular case that was a reason why Stephen had reached out to me, but because it's no longer a matter of life and death, I just omitted it. But there was a U.S. journalist who was detained by Israel named Jeremy Lafredo. I'm just going to take 30 seconds here to mention that he is back in New York and safe. It happened quietly, which I think is for the best, but had been accused of basically doing what, I don't know if you're familiar with, but if you saw what happened with Evan Gershkovich, where Vladimir Putin had detained a Wall Street Journal reporter, Evan was accused of collecting state secrets about Russian military operations against Ukraine. And in fact, Jeremy was on the ground covering the impact sites of Iranian missiles outside of the Mossad headquarters in, I believe, Tel Aviv, and then also went to the Negev desert to cover where a missile had impacted near an Israeli military base. Did what PBS NewsHour correspondent had done, did what an ABC News correspondent had done, and yet was singled out because of the fact that he comes from the gray zone, a very outspoken anti-empire media outlet, and so found himself in trouble, had to recruit the services of a civil rights attorney, a well-known civil rights attorney in Israel named Leah Semmel, who helped him obtain freedom. And so now he's back here, but it could have gotten worse. Fortunately for him, the military censor screwed up and allowed a Israeli journalist to publish a report on Jeremy Lafredo's arrest that included the allegedly offensive video report he had published. And so it was impossible for the judge to, with a straight face, keep him in jail, and he's back home safe. So I'm done. I thank you for your time today and welcoming me, and I'm glad to know you. And if I have a free Friday and I can make it, I will tune in to your conversation.